This morning before I read the gospel, I just want to say, okay, so there are a lot of really interesting texts in the Bible. The one that we have today is one of those very interesting texts. And so we always tend to listen to Scripture, or read Scripture very solemnly, and hear it that way. So today, actually, I really kind of want us to pay attention to the weirdness. Yes, I made that word up. I'm a theologian, I can do that. But the oddness, maybe, the oddity of this text, and pay attention to how parts of it might be really confusing or not make sense, or, listen to it as if you're seeing it for the first time on your favorite news channel, whatever that is, okay? So, the gospel lesson for this Transfiguration Sunday is taken from the 9th chapter of Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud suddenly overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came this great voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with him anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead would mean. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
So we have an absolutely fascinating gospel lesson this morning, right? There's a lot going on in that text, in that story that we hear that we call the Transfiguration, right? There's a lot of weird stuff. There's a lot of stuff that maybe seems abnormal, wild, and crazy, maybe almost to the point of being a little abstract, or maybe absurd, or maybe even comical a little bit, right? So, one of the things that I actually find really funny about this text that always comes up for me whenever I hear it is this thing with Moses and Elijah, right? Okay? So all of a sudden, boom, they're there, standing there with Jesus, and they recognize me. I go, what? Here are 2 dead guys, okay? Well, okay, but we know that Moses died, right? And Elijah, from we heard from our first lesson this morning, was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. So maybe he hasn't died, but at least these are 2 guys who have not been seen on the face of the planet for at least a couple hundred, if not a couple thousand years. Okay? How do they recognize Moses and Elijah? Huh? What did you say? Huh? Name tags? Name tags. I'm going to remember that. That's good. I like it. Right. But I mean, it's not like, they've got Facebook or Instagram and they can go and be scrolling through and, hey, look, it's Moses. They don't have that, right? Did you have an idea, Jasmine? Well, okay, yeah, but I mean, think about, okay, so if, let's go back far enough. If Christopher Columbus walked up to you, would you know that it was Christopher Columbus? Yeah, right. You're pulling my leg. No, but, so, I mean, even if we had they have a description of what they looked like, right? Okay, so yeah, Moses, he was this guy who was about 5'10", 180 pounds, with long black wavy hair and a big beard and carried a staff. Yeah, thanks. You just described about 90% of the men who lived in that region of the world at that period of time. You got one more guess, Jasmine? Well, yeah, right. She loves the Right, but like, okay, how do they recognize it, right? That's an oddity in the text, okay? Then we've got this whole transfiguration business, right? Jesus is transfigured before them, which, whatever that means. I mean, we know that apparently he's still recognizable, but he changed in form. He morphed in some way, shape, or form, right? We hear that there's this dazzling white. We understand that, right? But it kind of almost sounds a little bit like a Tide commercial. Or maybe Jesus discovered Clorox or something like that, right? But there's this white shining, this transfiguration that we don't understand, and that's an oddity in the text. And then you've got all these things that happen really suddenly, like all of a sudden, boom, there's a cloud, and they can't see, and there's this big voice. And then boom, the cloud's not there, and boom, Elijah and Moses, quote unquote, are gone, right? Like, that's kind of weird. That would be pretty disorienting, I would think, if all of a sudden, we're standing here and I'm talking, I'm giving the sermon, and all of a sudden it's, the sanctuary's filled with fog. That'd be a little awkward. Right? Right? Something's wrong, the gas line, I don't know. Right? And then there's the disciples. They totally don't get it. They really, really are clueless in the Gospel of Mark as to what is going on. Because, so our Gospel lesson for today was from chapter 9 in the Gospel of Mark. In the middle of chapter 8, just a couple of verses ago, Peter made this bold confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Son of God, right? And Jesus says, yes, Peter, you are absolutely correct. And then immediately begins to tell the disciples what that means, that he's going to suffer and die and rise again on the third day, right? And then Peter says, well, but wait a minute, Lord. No, the Messiah can't do that. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Remember that story, right? Okay, so that happens, and immediately after that story, Jesus starts telling the disciples about that there are some people who are standing there with him who will not die before the Son of Man comes in his glory, right? Immediately following Jesus telling them that is our story that we have today, where Jesus is, guess what? Standing on the mountaintop in his glory with Moses and Elijah. And they are clueless. I mean, what more do you want? Jesus told you who he is. He told you what that means. He told you that people were, that you were going to see him in his glory before you died. Boom, here it happens. And they have no idea what happened. So, although, I guess, of course, I should probably give the disciples a little bit of credit if they experienced those kinds of things, Jesus being transfigured, turning dazzling white, the cloud suddenly appearing, a big voice that we don't know where it's coming from, and all of a sudden, these two people disappear, right? Well, I might be a little bit disoriented and not know what to make of that either, right? But there are a lot of odd parts to this text that really are, in some ways, unexplainable. And going back to the disciples really kind of not understanding, if we're honest with one another and honest with ourselves, there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily understand either, right? About our faith, about God. There are a lot of things that remain kind of unknown or unexplainable to us. Even though we have Scripture, we have this story, we know about God creating the world. We know about God saving the Israelites by allowing them to pass through the Red Sea on dry land, right? We know about God helping the Israelites as they're trying to enter the Promised Land and walking around Jericho 7 times and the walls come down, right? We know about God sending Jesus and Jesus coming and being born, right? And Jesus healing people and teaching people and eating with tax collectors and sinners. We know the story, and we know that Jesus dies on a cross and that Jesus rises on the third day. We know that, and yet there is so much about our faith that really we don't understand and is unexplainable. Like the story, which is, I think that this story of the Transfiguration allows us to explore that a little bit. Because if we were to try to explain away some of those things, those oddities in this story of the Transfiguration in the text, really, guessing, right? Kind of like we were doing together just a little bit ago, right? We would be guessing. And yet in the midst of this completely odd, unexplainable story, there is one thing that is absolutely clear, that is extremely plain and totally straightforward. And that is the proclamation that we have from the voice in the cloud about who Jesus is. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. And then somehow, right, the one thing in this text that we can absolutely be sure about is that Jesus is God's beloved Son. And somehow the rest of the story then becomes a demonstration of that proclamation. The entire story, whether we understand it or not, is a demonstration of Jesus' identity as God's beloved Son. Even if everything else is entirely uncertain, we know who Jesus is. We know Jesus is God's beloved. And then the voice says, listen to him. And yes, this is a command, but it also confirms that what Jesus has already been telling the disciples about himself, being the Messiah and the Son of God, that what he has been telling them is actually true. Right? That he knows what he's talking about. Listen to him. Because we had Peter confessing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then Jesus told them what that means, right? That Jesus isn't going to be the Messiah who comes in with might and power and destroys the enemy and wipes them out and restores things to how they once were so that things can be like the good old days and like they were before, right? That's not what it means that Jesus is the Messiah. But Jesus is instead going to be the Messiah that suffers pain and torture, the Messiah that dies on a cross, the Messiah that rises from the dead. This proclamation about Jesus is not just true for Peter, James, and John. It is also true for us today, in this time and this place. Jesus is still God's beloved Son, the Messiah that comes not to remove all the bad things from our lives, to return things to the way that they once were, so that we can go back to the good old days, and so that things can be like they were before. But instead, Jesus is the Messiah, God's beloved Son, God in human form, the Messiah that comes into the world for you, the Messiah that enters into your life and takes you by the hand and says, you are good enough. You are loved as you are. You are not in this alone. Whatever your situation is, addiction, grief, cancer, worry, stress, transition, whatever you are struggling with, that will not be the end of your story. It will come to an end. Maybe not how you think, but it will come to an end. Not even death will be the end of your story, because just as Christ rose from the dead, so you too will rise to new life. Jesus is God's beloved Son, the Messiah who has come into the world. That is the proclamation to Peter, James, and John on that mountaintop at the Transfiguration. That is the proclamation that is for you. That is the proclamation that is for the world. And this proclamation cannot stay here. Going back to the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John wanted to build 3 dwelling places, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. They wanted to stay on the mountaintop. They wanted to stay in the moment. But Jesus would have none of that, because the proclamation needed to go elsewhere. In the same way, the proclamation of Jesus as God's beloved Son, the Messiah, must not stay here. It cannot stay in this worship. It cannot stay in this building. It cannot stay amongst the group of people that we call Grace Lutheran Church. It must go out into the world. There are so many people, individuals, groups of people, countries, areas of the world that need hope, who need to hear of Jesus, God's beloved Son, who will also take them by the hand and raise them to new life. And you and I, as hearers of this proclamation, get to bring them that hope. Brothers and sisters, though we may not understand everything, though there may be many things that are unexplainable for us, I invite all of us to hear once again the proclamation that is absolutely certain. Jesus is God's beloved Son, who has come to the world to take you by the hand and to bring new life to you and to the world.